Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos, professores do programa de pós-graduação Santiago Dantas, demais colegas e ao público que nos assiste nesse momento. Bom, era para esse evento ter sido feito presencialmente no final desse ano, enfim, para que a gente pudesse celebrar o lançamento do livro pela editora Unesp, mas, enfim, a gente teve que adaptar toda a nossa dinâmica acadêmica para essa nova metodologia de divulgação científica, e por isso que a gente vai fazer o lançamento do livro nesse formato online. Então, é com muita satisfação que hoje a gente dá início a esse evento. O lançamento do livro Retorno da Geopolítica na Europa, Mecanismos, Sociais e Crises de Identidade de Política Externa, organizado pelo professor Stefano Guzzini, professor da Universidade de Uppsala e da PUC-Rio, do Departamento de Relações Internacionais, e traduzido por mim. O livro sai pela editora Unesp, na coleção Paz, Defesa e Segurança Internacional, do Santiago Dantas e do Grupo de Estudos de Defesa e Segurança Internacional, o GED, como a gente carinhosamente chama. O nosso evento, então, está sendo transmitido ao vivo pelo YouTube. Sintam-se muito à vontade para enviar seus comentários, para fazer suas perguntas ao final da fala dos nossos convidados. A gente passa, então, a palavra a vocês e eu vou, enfim, fazer essa mediação e a leitura dos comentários e das perguntas a eles. Então, a minha função aqui hoje ela é dupla. Eu vou servir ao mesmo tempo de moderadora dessa mesa e do debate, e caso haja tempo, eu posso, então, fazer alguns comentários sobre a importância do livro para a realidade acadêmica brasileira e para a realidade brasileira fora também da academia. Cada um dos nossos palestrantes vai ter mais ou menos 20, 30 minutos. O professor Stefano Guzzini vai falar em inglês e eu e a professora Fernanda vamos falar em português, então a gente vai fazer esse esforço de ter o nosso evento bilíngue, até para que, enfim, o nosso público se sinta convidado enfim, a se engajar com ele. Então, se vocês quiserem fazer mais uma vez perguntas e comentários em português, podem fazer, e se a gente necessitar de tradução, eu posso fazer a tradução, caso o professor Stefano Guzzini, enfim, não tenha, precise que eu coloque em palavras, enfim, no inglês. Então, uma breve apresentação dos nossos dois palestrantes hoje. O professor Stefano Guzzini, além de ser professor do Instituto de Relações Internacionais da PUC-Rio, como eu mencionei anteriormente, é professor de Government na Universidade de Uppsala e pesquisador sênior do Danish Institute for International Studies. As suas principais áreas de pesquisa são teorias sociais e políticas de relações internacionais, estudos de segurança, abordagens construtivistas da análise de política externa, bem como teorias de poder. Recentemente, ele tem trabalhado com metodologias interpretativistas, como, por exemplo, rastreamento de processos, que a gente comumente chama de process tracing, no inglês, mecanismos sociais e noções de causalidade no debate pós-positivista, e geopolítica crítica aplicada à Europa, que é um dos principais temas do livro que a gente lança hoje. Ele possui trabalhos publicados nas principais revistas da área e livros traduzidos em diversos idiomas, como o livro de hoje também. É editor da revista International Theory, editor associado da Contexto Internacional e ex-editor da Journal of International Relations and Development. A professora Fernanda, enfim, muito obrigada, professora Fernanda, muito obrigada, professor Stefano. A professora Fernanda é professora assistente do Departamento de Relações Internacionais da Universidade Estadual Paulista, no campus de Franca, do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Planejamento e Análise de Políticas Públicas da Unesp e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Relações Internacionais Santiago Dantas. Ela é doutora em Geografia Humana pela Universidade de São Paulo e possui graduação em Relações Internacionais pela Universidade Estadual Paulista e mestre em Geografia na área de Geografia Humana também pela Universidade de São Paulo. Durante o doutorado, ela realizou intercâmbio de pesquisa na Universidade de Utrecht, na Holanda, e realizou o pós-doutorado na Universidade Autônoma de Barcelona. Ela hoje coordena o grupo de estudos em política e direito ambiental internacional na Unesp e tem experiência nas áreas de política ambiental global, geografia política e geopolítica, relações internacionais e política pública, atuando nos seguintes temas: política ambiental global, política ambiental brasileira, governança e gestão de recursos hídricos, energias renováveis, Amazônia, instituições de integração regional na América Latina. Então, sem mais delongas, eu passo primeiramente a palavra para o professor Stefano Guzzini e depois, na sequência, eu passo então a palavra para a professora Fernanda. Professor Stefano, a palavra é toda sua.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much for having me with you. I'm sorry to speak English with you rather than Portuguese. I would love to have it in Portuguese. I could speak Italian, which is somewhat closer, but I will stick to English, which is not my native language either, obviously. But so we do when we are in academia. Well, thanks again, and I'm very happy to see the book appear in Portuguese, and I want to thank Barbara again for the year-long work which she had put into it, and which has now come to fruition. And I hope that she will be her work will be how can I say, get the welcome and the response that it merits. Thanks again, Barbara. But I will have the time now for 30 minutes to give you some ideas of what the book is all about. It's a book about Europe, so I will talk much about Europe, but there's a part on theory which I think one can think about how it might possibly be transferred, translated, contextualized elsewhere than in Europe. So the starting point will be a puzzle which is mainly geared towards a European historical moment, but the second part will be more about the theoretical development that can come out of this. So let me start where all started. In 1994, I got my first job after the PhD, and that was at the Central European University in Budapest. So I come to Hungary not knowing much about Hungary, but being in the early days after the end of the Cold War, pretty much attracted by the possibility to finally see that part of Europe which I had hardly seen before. I'd been in Poland for 3 weeks in 1980. I had made, ever since the opening, a couple of trips, but here I got a position, I was teaching at the Central European University. And as a good German Italian, having seen the end of the Cold War, the wall coming down, basically this enormous Damocles sword that has been put over European politics, lifted, taken away, I was astonished by many of the students who would refer to mainly geopolitical writers. In international relations, the main writers translated in the early days of the 90s were Zbigniew Brzezinski, which is obvious for the Poles, but not necessarily elsewhere. It was Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilization, and it was, at the time, Henry Kissinger's Diplomacy. So these are books which are written out of a tradition which is a relatively pessimistic tradition, and the geopolitical tradition is the one which is most determinist about things which, well, cannot change very quickly or should not be changing very quickly. Even realism was under huge difficulties in the days after the end of the Cold War, because it could not just not predict, but not really explain how the Cold War could come to an end, given the assumption of self-help, competition, balance of power. There was no retrenchment by a superpower as the Soviet Union at the time did. So I was impressed by what I felt was a contradiction. We had the biggest peace achievement in the 20th century for Europe, at least, while having a resurgence of geopolitical, materialist, and pretty militarist writings in many countries in Europe. So, as I found out, it was not just in Eastern Europe that these particular writers came up. In Italy, there was a new journal coming up called Limes, which was a journal in geopolitics. There was a second one actually done afterwards. In the Soviet Union, then afterwards in Russia, there was a special committee for geopolitics of the parliament. When Huntington traveled to Estonia, he was invited by the prime minister, who made an introduction for the presentation of his book when he did that to the public. So there was a awareness, a quite large awareness of geopolitical writing, and that happened at the very moment in which we had a huge peace success, and I couldn't figure out why. So that became my puzzle. So where does this come from, that at the very moment in which people had overcome divisions, all the literature which is going to show us that we should be rather pessimistic about the future, or about politics more generally, had a heyday, had a comeback. So of course this was a first hunch. So there needed to be some analysis of, was that really a puzzle, and was that comeback happening really everywhere? So the first question is it really a puzzle? Because, in fact, maybe it wasn't. Maybe there was a quite easy explanation for why this would be happening. And there were two candidates. The first one was in the wake of John Mersheimer's type of analysis, which was to say, look, we are back to the future. The Yugoslav wars, because that's also Europe, the Yugoslav wars are that which is basically telling us what the European future is potentially to be. So rather than thinking that this nice peace dividend is coming in, the end of the Cold War will bring much more insecurity to Europe. And this little war tells us already that this is going to happen. And I found the argument never entirely convincing, besides the fact, of course, that we haven't seen any of these major wars yet happening. And we are now 30 years after this. But I thought it was not very convincing because Mersheimer basically told me that instead of thinking that the bipolar superpower competition was the most important component of international affairs, it was a civil war in Yugoslavia, which was the telling story. So what happens in Yugoslavia was considered to be more important than what happened on the global front between the West and the East. And I didn't think that was tenable. Besides the point that I don't think that history just picks up where it left before. It's kind of an idea that there was a Cold War overlay which froze everything into, and then once you take it off, then there will be, the heat will come up and we will just return to all the nationalist difficulties that we had beforehand. This is not what's happening in Europe. But there was a second way of telling me that the puzzle was perhaps not such a puzzle, and that came from geographers. In particular, critical geographers. And geographers told me, and that became the beginning of my story, they told me that, look, when there are major changes in international affairs that have to do with territory, border, political alignments, and so on, it is pretty normal that geographic imagination will fire up. That countries who have been used to a particular position, to think of their position, when that position starts to be shifting, then they start thinking of where they are and implicitly also who they are. And so it would be perfectly normal to expect that countries which have undergone now major changes, like new borders, or have been split up, or indeed have come into being again, like the Baltic states, that these countries will have references to geography, and then therefore also potentially to geopolitics. And I think that argument is correct. But it didn't explain why the revival happened in some countries and it didn't happen in other countries. So the book has 6 case studies, which were done by specialists on particular countries, all of them also theorists of international relations. Benar Bilgin for Turkey, Peter Drulak for the Czech Republic, who later became also Deputy Foreign Minister and Ambassador to France. Fabio Petito and Elisabetta Righi for Italy. Andreas Behnke for Germany. And then we had Merje Koos for Estonia. And I hope I haven't forgotten anyone, but if not, it will come back. And the question here was, why would it happen in Italy or in Russia? Natalia Mozarova and Alexander Astrov. Russia, why would it happen in Italy, in Russia, in Estonia, and in Turkey? But why didn't it happen in Germany and in the Czech Republic, where no such revival of geopolitical thinking took place? So we need to make a comparison. We need to understand what went on. And then starts the analysis. So what could be other reasons, accompanying reasons, which could explain why in some countries, from this change that the Cold War brought, the end of the Cold War brought to them, led to a revival of geopolitics, and to others it didn't. And so we went into a series of accompanying factors that would be important to look at. The first one is a kind of ideational path dependency, to put it very jargonistic. So if you're living in a country which has a political culture that is very strongly materialist, where people would usually think politics very strongly in materialist terms, then you could expect that materialist theories would have an easier day exactly in that moment in which there's a certain type of a crisis coming on. And I come to this idea of a crisis a little bit later. So that would be one possibility. And for sure, in Italy and in Russia, there's a strong materialist tradition which could have been part of the explanation of what was going on. Then another type of factor that we took into account is the idea that there could be different types of expert cultures. So how is the system of expertise organized? After all, we were looking for understanding why we had a revival of a particular type of idea, geopolitical thought. So how is the idea construction organized in particular countries? Who is part of this? Who is responsible for it? How are ideas disseminated? And we found two particular components which might help geopolitics to become more prevalent. One has to do with the distance that academia or think tanks have from the government. So the more there is an independence, the more that the production of ideas has some autonomy, the less the risk that ideas will be mainly put into the service of some government thinking, and very often that would mean nationalist thinking. It's not a necessary link, but we found out that in some countries it could be a link. So for instance, if there are countries with a strong peace research tradition, you would think that there will be a stronger resistance to a revival of geopolitical thought. And that was the case for sure in Germany. The other one is how strongly this component of expert culture is divided or separated from the military, because geopolitics is closely related to the military. It is one of the thinking, at least in the classical European tradition, which very often is that which is coming out of military strategy. And you can understand why. For the military, well, geography is important. You cannot just imagine that away. It's something that you need to take into account into your strategy, long-term strategy. And so the combination between geography and military strategy is something which is almost self-evident. And then we had political struggle. There could be a last factor which was particularly strong, like the one before for Turkey, namely that geopolitics very often is the ideology of nationalism, or it is stronger than just realism in that regard. It's an ideology of nationalism, and therefore if there were nationalist parties who could mobilize it after the end of the Cold War, then there would be a bigger possibility for geopolitical thinking to return. But the most important component of all of them, of all the issues that we found, was what we call the foreign policy identity crisis. So all the factors I mentioned beforehand would be accompanying factor, but the more fundamental factor, and the one that would go into our analysis afterwards, was that most of the countries underwent a crisis of their own self-understanding, what they were in terms of foreign policy, and of the recognition that they would get from other countries for their role and particular function in world politics. That can be because there were new borders, that can be because Italy and Turkey had a very strategic position in the Mediterranean during the Cold War, but the moment that you have no Soviet or Russian threat anymore, what would be their particular importance? You had countries like Germany who would come together again and would in principle see its own identity to be redefined, or could at least have seen its own identity redefined. You have seen the Soviet Union becoming Russia, declining, shrinking, leaving all the buffer it had won during the Second World War independent, autonomous. And what would that mean for this new country. It was no longer really a superpower on a par with the United States. So where would it find itself? So we posited that the most important component for understanding geopolitics was the following: that many countries would undergo a kind of foreign policy identity crisis, that they were in search of their role and self-definition of a new narrative that would be putting an identity of the country together. And in that quest, in that search, geopolitical thinking, with its ease, with its geographic determination and reference points, like the cardinal points, came as an easy rescue and was easily mobilized. Now, if it was easily mobilized, or could be easily mobilized, it should have been in all the countries, but it wasn't. And so, as I said before, we found two where it wasn't. It was neither in Germany nor in the Czech Republic, or Czechia as it is now officially called. In Germany, people would have said, yeah, well, you would expect this, because after all, I mean, Germany lost the Second World War. It went under a huge redefinition of its identity. Geopolitics was part of the arsenal of Nazi doctrine, because indeed, Haushofer, the major thinkings of Lebensraum were all informed by a certain German geopolitical tradition, but not only German. So it is basically the past which made it that it didn't return. Maybe also because Germany was not really having a crisis. The new Germany was basically the Western Germany writ large in many regards. So the identification or the collective memory, the rewriting of German history was all done in terms of what Western Germany was before. By the way, something that Germany is still somewhat suffering from, because there's a part of the common memory that has never been really integrated or entirely integrated into what now stands for Germany. But more interesting is actually the Czech Republic, because the Czech Republic, I mean, there were every reason that it should be more concerned. There was this huge German neighbor, there were the old fears about being the small country. It went into a division from Czech Republic from Slovakia. So there were many reasons which would, in principle, also sparkle geographic imagination and perhaps make a return of geopolitics. But according to Peter Drulák, there were no returns of geopolitical thinking in the 90s. I mean, the main analysis is all about the 90s, where the puzzle is strongest, where we had this peace around, except for Yugoslavia, and where people would therefore not expect their revival there to be. So his argument is that to some extent, the Czech Republic had also no identity crisis, because it considered itself, as it was so famously said, a kidnapped West. And being a kidnapped West meant that, well, once the kidnapping is over, you just return to what you were and always have been. At least this was what in the 90s produced the identity discourse of the Czech state and Czech foreign policy. Also, this has changed later over time. There was a country in which I think there was an identity crisis and there was no revival of geopolitics. So whereas these two maybe had no identity crisis, according at least to my authors, they had none, Sweden had and still has a kind of identity crisis, because if you define yourself as a neutral country during the Cold War, what does it mean to be a neutral country when the Cold War is over? And so there's the endless discussion in Sweden about maybe or not joining NATO, whether or not joining the EU, whether or not joining the military component of the EU, and so on. But also there, despite Rudolf Schlein, despite the geopolitical tradition which runs back quite long, in fact, Schlein is the one who invented the word, there was no revival in Sweden. Now, so far, so good. So who cares about all these European countries, whether they had a revival or whether they had no revival? And here now comes my last part, which I think is the important part for taking away, maybe for somewhere else. I think it is not innocent if and when geopolitical thought comes back. Because I define geopolitical thought by four things. Two of them are quite easy, shared by many people in international relations, but two are slightly more, well, challenging. The first one is the idea that everything in the world is interconnected, interconnectedness. So whatever happens in some part of the world will have an effect on some other part of the world. There is nothing which is really isolated, autonomous, untouched in this world anymore. The second is the idea that the world is finite. There's only one. That's where it came from in geopolitics. It came from the time when Africa was divided by European powers. The English, British went from north and south and tried to meet, and the French tried to do it east and west. Well, you can imagine that at some point the two had to meet, which was in southern Sudan, today southern Sudan, in Fashoda, in which the two countries came to a stalemate. And it became clear that, well, there was no new land. The cake was the cake there was. There was no new part in that not yet developed, not yet occupied part that could be taken up. It was an idea that, well, the world is finite. The political systems have to live with what there is and have no new ground, no other ground on which to look for compensations or anything like this. They would head-to-head confront each other. The third idea of geopolitics is derived from Malthus. It's Malthusian. Malthus was a political economist and a priest, and who said, or became famous for a big problem that he was looking for, namely that demographic development was exponential, but our food supply would be in a linear increase. So at some point in time, there was not enough food for all of us. And demography is a very important component of most geopolitical thinking, in particular in the nationalist environment. So there's only one cake. Worse, there are more and more people trying to get a piece of that cake. So there's an implicit idea that there will be struggles coming out of scarcity, that everyone wants to keep, if not increase, its part of the cake, when yet the cake is not going to be bigger. This, of course, has been criticized by liberals and Marxists and anybody else who showed that one could also increase the food supply. But this particular, how can I say, demographic anxiety is extremely strong in classical geopolitical thought, and I believe also in neoclassical geopolitical thought, the one that came up in the 90s again. And then finally, and that's the one, of course, which is least acceptable, geopolitics can be connected to social Darwinism, to the so-called survival of the fittest. If there is scarcity, if there is struggle, well, only some will win. The other ones won't. So it is one of the most, how can I say, pessimistic, conflictual theories there is. And if that is coming back, well, that can be quite important. And so I will finish by giving you two takeaways on mechanisms that we thought would be available from this study. The first one is coming from these identity crises. So we have found out that there are different ways of dealing with an identity crisis. So the identity crisis is not that there are new things happening. The identity crisis is that out of our way of dealing with our own identity, we have no good answer of how to deal with them. So an identity crisis is not just an outside effect. As I said, the Germans had no troubles with the end of the Cold War, and apparently also the Czech had no troubles in the beginning either. So they didn't develop a crisis. So it's not the event which prompts the crisis, it is the understanding of the event. And that's an interpretivist move. It's the understanding of the event which produces that crisis. So is the security tradition, is the security imaginary able to accommodate or not this new event? And there are different ways of dealing with it if there is a crisis evolving, namely that there is a mismatch between the way countries think of themselves and countries as they are now in the world and as they are seen by others in this world. One is to adapt, which is to make the point, well, times have changed, we have to change. Say like South Africa did, which was in a huge outside stigmatizing environment, and which produced a huge internal identity crisis of what South Africa could actually stand for. Another one was to deny that there is any crisis going on. A third one would be a time of negotiation to say, well, hey guys, you just understood us wrongly. So we are actually this and the other, and so we fit perfectly into the role that the international community might perhaps allot us to. And finally, there can be, for some major powers, the attempt to turn it around, to say, well, whatever your construction of our identity is on our role, that's wrong. We have one. We want to impose it. It's imposition, which has been a policy which the Russian Federation has been trying to do in the European context for quite a while. So what we have is a foreign policy. Then it might produce a crisis given whether or not it fits within the security imaginary. And this crisis can have different ways of being dealt with. So it's an open mechanism. It can go one way, it can go another way. This is depending on certain countries. And remember now, coming back, some of the factors I mentioned at the very beginning, the ideational path dependency, the political struggles, the way that the expert field and culture has been organized, for instance. So this is to start making an analysis in which, well, you understand some of the foreign policy moves perhaps, but truly the understanding of the outside world before that in terms of how countries deal with their biographic narrative, how they build up their identity and therefore also understand their own interests in international affairs. So that's a classical constructivist move. And I just make that move a little bit more dynamic in the book by seeing how these identity struggles, which are going on all the time because it's never fixed, can lead to crisis and how their solution of the crisis might be short-term or long-term. Because as we see for the Turkish case, for instance, in the book, geopolitics doesn't fix it. It cannot fix it. And Turkey has been looking ever since for redefining its role, as you can see also in its present policies. The other mechanism is what I call a vicious circle of essentialization. So what happens is that you can have a self-fulfilling prophecy. If everyone believes in Huntington's Clash of Civilization, then, well, if everyone behaves like Huntington would then like to behave, then you will get a clash of civilization. You will have ethnic cleansing, you will try to purify your country, and you will make sure to defend yourself against any other civilization which might encroach on your particular one. Now, when geopolitics becomes accepted by everyone around, there's an essentialization both of identities, just as what I mentioned with Huntington, but also an essentialization of nature as it is out there, and of geography. And so everything becomes fixed because that's the only way that you can say that nature, because geopolitics is reading politics off the map, that nature has been telling us that we need to do this rather than any other things. And so this essentialization of identity on the one hand, in which so nativist, populist, and other movements would feed from, is closely connected to geopolitics. And that is my last word. It is in that regard interesting that it is not 9/11, at least for the Northerners, who believe that much of geopolitics and the return of militarization and so on is typically something which comes with 9/11. It's something which happened already beforehand. It is the peace which produced the revival of geopolitical thought, not the attack of 9/11. And what it does is, as all geopolitics does, is to reverse Clausewitz. Rather than seeing war as the prolongation of politics by other means, in which war will be just the means of politics, geopolitics does see politics as a prolongation of war by other means. War is the default position. Think about Malthus and think about social Darwinism. War is the default position out of which you cannot go. And so, of course, if everyone believes that war is the default position, then we get a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is turning a peaceful European security order in one in which, in principle, we all prepare for a war that would not be necessary to happen in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, professor. Muito obrigada pela apresentação do livro. Eu passo, então, a palavra agora para a professora Fernanda, para as considerações dela. Professora Fernanda.
Muito obrigada, Bárbara. Thank you very much, Professor Guzzini. É um prazer participar desse debate sobre o lançamento do livro, traduzido para o português pela editora da Unesp. Eu gostaria de parabenizar os professores, Stefano Guzzini, que já contribuiu diversas vezes, né, com o nosso programa de pós-graduação em Relações Internacionais, e também parabenizar a Bárbara por esse esforço enorme que, inclusive, os nossos alunos agradecem, né, esse esforço da tradução, que é muito difícil, mas muito importante para inclusão, né, na educação, para a disseminação do conhecimento. Então, parabenizo os dois por essas iniciativas. É realmente muito importante todo o debate que o livro traz, e daí eu já estou conversando com os meus próprios alunos, né, os meus próprios colegas, e porque, assim como o professor Stefano, eu vou falar um pouco do porquê eu também cheguei a estudar essas temáticas relacionadas à geopolítica, né, então eu estou, assim como o professor Stefano, nessa área entre as relações internacionais e a geografia, né, quando eu terminei o bacharelado em relações internacionais e eu estava pensando na pós-graduação, uma coisa que me incomodava muito era esse discurso liberal, neoliberal, né, sobre a governança, e principalmente a governança ambiental, essa discussão sobre tratados ambientais, né, que é mais a minha área de pesquisa, deslocada bastante da realidade, deslocada do que acontece no território, nos lugares, isso que me levou para a geografia, né, para entender essa dinâmica dos lugares e do território, e depois voltar para as relações internacionais e ministrar a disciplina de geopolítica por vários anos já, antes mesmo de eu cheguei a ministrar a disciplina de geografia política também, alguns anos, e então já faz muito tempo, já faz um tempo, digamos assim, que eu estou nessa área. Então, esse livro traz questões muito importantes para o debate contemporâneo sobre geopolítica, a partir de uma análise crítica, né? E quando me convidaram para fazer esse debate, eu tinha acabado de reler um texto muito interessante da grande geógrafa Berta Becker, a geografia e o resgate da geopolítica, um texto de 88, né? E me chamou muita atenção porque esse texto da Berta Becker, de 88, ele dialoga bastante com esses resultados da pesquisa do professor Stefano Guzzini e dos seus colegas que colaboraram com o livro, né? Essa ideia de qual é a contribuição da análise sobre a geopolítica, né? E daí a Berta Becker falando para a área de geografia e o professor Stefano falando para a área de relações internacionais também, mas para essas duas áreas, né? O que é muito importante para a gente, que eu sempre comento com os meus alunos, né? É que, como diz a Berta Becker, cada vez mais o controle do espaço é utilizado como controle social, né? Então, ela fala o modo pelo qual o espaço é apropriado e gerido, e o conhecimento desse processo constitui expressão e condição das relações de poder. Então, como ela fala, o resgate desse conhecimento sobre a geopolítica é fundamental para a gente entender como os estados, né, se comportam, como diversos atores se comportam nas relações internacionais, especificamente na área de política externa, como o professor Stefano Guzzini nos apresenta no livro, né? E também fiquei pensando em como esse debate ele é muito importante para o momento em que vivemos no Brasil, né? Em que nós temos um Estado novamente bastante militarizado, né, e as políticas públicas, então, se tornam, né, políticas de segurança. A Berta Becker também era uma grande especialista em Amazônia, né, e hoje nós vemos a política do atual governo para a Amazônia é uma política de segurança, né, e não, que não trata alguns temas fundamentais, né, de conflitos sociais e degradação ambiental, por exemplo, que nós temos nessa região do Brasil. Então, lendo, né, o livro e pensando nessas discussões, nessas questões levantadas, eu fico pensando por que é importante nós estudarmos no Brasil, né, esse retorno da geopolítica na Europa. É lógico que, como área de relações internacionais, nós temos que estudar o mundo, realmente, né, mas para além disso, essa interconexão que o professor mencionou, né, que nos coloca todos interconectados, mas algumas questões específicas vieram à minha cabeça, né, que quais são os efeitos, né, do retorno da geopolítica em alguns países da Europa para as suas relações externas, né? O que isso representa, né, por exemplo, para as relações com a América Latina e o Brasil, né? E também se nós estaríamos vendo o retorno da geopolítica em outras partes do mundo, né? Ou podemos pensar até no Brasil, estamos vendo um retorno da geopolítica no Brasil, nesse atual governo militarizado, como eu falei, ou se na verdade nós nunca saímos, né, desse imaginário geopolítico do Estado brasileiro, né? Eu fiquei pensando nessas questões e como é importante nós fazermos uma reflexão sobre essas questões, né? Recentemente, também estava coordenando a disciplina Sociedades Plurais, da rede DIP, ligada ao programa CAPSPRINT, e nós tivemos vários pesquisadores europeus, né, e uma discussão muito grande nessa disciplina foi exatamente como a União Europeia estava lidando com a crise dos refugiados e com a questão da pandemia. E é interessante ver a securitização dessas políticas, digamos assim, de resposta, né, tanto em relação à pandemia, quanto, e principalmente, em relação à política para os refugiados e imigrantes ilegais, digamos assim, né. Uma coisa que chamou muita atenção das nossas discussões, né, entre os alunos, era essa, eu não sei se eu posso dizer um pensamento dicotômico, mas talvez uma imaginação, né, porque não geopolítica também, mas como que parece que ainda permanece, né, essa visão da União Europeia de uma separação entre a Europa e o resto, né, então, dessa resposta de securitização para os refugiados, né, como você tem uma política de direitos humanos para os de dentro e uma política diferente para os de fora, né, então, que é uma política de securitização, né, para lidar, né, com os refugiados, os imigrantes, e isso é uma coisa também que me chamou a atenção quando a gente pensa, e que o professor mencionou, o ciclo de essencialização, né, e essa esse ciclo, né, que torna esses imaginários, né, que pensa, né, como elementos fixos, digamos assim, do espaço, né, tanto o território como as fronteiras, ou seja, os elementos talvez geográficos, né, que esse retorno da geopolítica traz. Então, uma essencialização, né, dentro das políticas externas dos países, né, isso nós precisamos, eu acho que, de uma análise de geopolítica crítica, ou se preferir, geografia política crítica, para entender os efeitos disso, né, nos países, como disse o professor, mas também os efeitos nas suas relações com outros países, né. E nesse sentido, que eu acho que é uma grande contribuição, o livro, e não só nesse debate da geopolítica crítica, mas também suas contribuições na área epistemológica e metodológica também para a área de relações internacionais, especificamente dentro da perspectiva construtivista, mas que que traz, né, eu acho que uma reflexão muito importante epistemológica para a área como um todo, né. Bem, então eu acho que o meu papel era levantar mais questões, né, de como a importância dessa discussão do retorno da geopolítica na política externa de vários países, né, na Europa, seus efeitos para a relação com o exterior, digamos assim, mas também eu acho que traz muitas contribuições para a gente pensar em outros lugares do mundo, né, e especialmente para o Brasil, né, que são várias questões que também, de uma forma complementar, eu acho que estava muito presente no trabalho da professora Berta Becker, que foi muito importante, né, dentro da geopolítica. São poucas mulheres que escreviam, né, sobre geopolítica na década de 80, 90, e ela teve um papel muito importante no Brasil e para desenvolvimento, né, da área da geopolítica no Brasil, que também, retomando um pouco do que o professor Stefano falou sobre os especialistas, né, da área, quem dissemina as ideias, né, que a geopolítica brasileira também sempre foi muito marcada por militares, né, que desenvolveram a área de geopolítica desde, né, da sua forma clássica, né, no início do século XX, e que só depois do final da década de 80 é que a geopolítica realmente começou a ser mais estudada, digamos assim, nas universidades, né, principalmente nos cursos de geografia. Bem, era mais isso, colocar algumas reflexões e talvez contribuir com o debate do público, e agradeço novamente a presença e a participação do professor Stefano Buzini, a participação da Bárbara, que organizou esse debate, e parabéns pela tradução.
Obrigada, Fernanda. Bom, enquanto a gente espera do nosso público alguns comentários e algumas perguntas, eu queria aproveitar, então, o espaço para fazer alguns comentários. Eu acho que, enfim, primeiro agradecer a vocês, pela fala. Eu acho que o livro, ele traz algumas possíveis contribuições, né, para o Brasil. A primeira dessas contribuições é para a área de relações internacionais do Brasil. Sobretudo porque eu acho que o livro ele se insere na interseção de 3 sub-áreas importantes, né, e 3 sub-áreas que têm uma tradição de pesquisa, digamos assim, no Brasil. Pelo menos 2 delas têm uma tradição de pesquisa no Brasil. A primeira é dos estudos de segurança internacional. Né, o livro, ao apontar que a geopolítica não se refere à política internacional como um todo, mas que se refere a uma faceta, né, uma parte muito específica da política internacional que destaca, por exemplo, suposições sobre o papel material e humano, dinâmicas de inimizade e competição, e que por conta disso entende que por mais que essas dinâmicas não se traduzam em embates militares concretamente, o conflito ele acaba sendo inevitável, e que, portanto, um olhar militarista para as relações internacionais é necessário. Afinal de contas, como o próprio professor Stefano colocou, se a guerra é o ponto de partida, né, se é a base padrão da qual a gente parte, então é melhor se preparar para ela. Então, o primeiro campo, acadêmicos de relações internacionais, que eu acho que o livro se insere, os estudos de segurança internacional e pode trazer contribuições para o nosso debate acadêmico sobre segurança internacional. A segunda contribuição é para os estudos de análise de política externa. A gente no Brasil tem uma tradição de política externa que normalmente parte de uma tradição um tanto quanto clássica, né, que se volta justamente para os estudos da diplomacia, para a história das relações internacionais, e que utiliza, para fazer essas análises, uma metodologia que parte muito daquilo que a gente pode chamar de hermenêutica do processo, ou seja, uma avaliação histórica de como a política externa se deu ao longo de um período temporal específico. E eu acho que o livro, justamente por trazer uma outra possibilidade de pesquisa em análise de política externa, faz com que a gente possa incluir no debate de análise de política externa no Brasil não só temáticas mais contemporâneas, como, por exemplo, o debate que para a gente é contemporâneo da identidade, status, reconhecimento, emoções, gênero, raça e por aí vai, mas também que possa trazer como contribuição a utilização de metodologias para os estudos de análise de política externa. E a outra contribuição que eu acho que o livro se insere no nosso debate acadêmico de relações internacionais é sobre considerações teóricas e metodológicas, né? O livro desenvolve uma metodologia que, na minha interpretação muito particular, é uma metodologia extremamente elegante. Ele utiliza o que o livro chama de um process trace interpretativista e a identificação de mecanismos sociais, né, para tentar estabelecer uma relação de causalidade sem recorrer a uma causalidade do tipo positivista. E eu acho que para os nossos alunos e para os nossos colegas de relações internacionais, talvez o livro seja muito interessante, até para que a gente possa, talvez, estabelecer uma espécie de engenharia reversa com o livro, né? Que o livro sirva de inspiração para outros trabalhos que buscam se utilizar dessas metodologias, mas que talvez ainda tenham receio de se reportar a elas por achar que talvez o rigor metodológico só esteja naquelas pesquisas que partam de uma avaliação positivista das relações internacionais e de uma metodologia positivista de relações internacionais. Então, o livro, enfim, e eu aprendi muito com a tradução do livro, então não só foi um trabalho, como foi um processo de aprendizado também. Eu acho que o livro, ele congrega múltiplos interesses daqueles que se localizam na área dos estudos de segurança internacional, daqueles que se localizam na área de análise de política externa e daqueles que gostariam de ter contato com outras metodologias para aplicar para os seus estudos, sem necessariamente estarem nessas duas sub-áreas de relações internacionais. E, além disso, eu acho que o livro traz uma contribuição não só para a realidade acadêmica de relações internacionais, mas talvez, e como a Fernanda mesma apontou, e eu acho que apontou de forma brilhante, acho que traz uma contribuição para a nossa realidade brasileira atual. O Stefano, no prefácio dele para a edição brasileira, eu vou ler só aqui um trechinho para deixar vocês curiosos e garantir que vocês leiam o livro. Ele colocou que mais importante, enfim, nas palavras dele, mais importante para funcionar bem, qualquer tradução desse tipo é uma via de mão dupla, na qual ontologias se encontram, geralmente em um novo local. E se tudo funcionar como deveria, horizontes se fundem. Então, eu acho que o livro, ele não deve ser compreendido dentro de uma lógica de que a Europa, como o Stefano mesmo coloca no prefácio dele, de que a Europa tem lições a oferecer ao Brasil, ou à América Latina, ou à América do Sul. Mas talvez o livro possa ser considerado como uma espécie de um reservatório de insights, em que a gente possa mobilizar esses insights para compreender a nossa própria realidade. E eu acho que esse exercício de reflexão é um exercício de reflexão fundamental no momento em que a gente vive hoje no Brasil, principalmente na atual conjuntura em que as Forças Armadas têm uma ampla participação e uma ampla legitimidade na política brasileira. Então, para a gente pensar como essa participação das Forças Armadas no debate político e no debate público brasileiro faz com que talvez, possivelmente, essas Forças Armadas tragam com elas, né, enfim, uma série de concepções militaristas, tanto para dentro quanto para fora. Para dentro, no debate da segurança pública e na construção de um outro, né, de um inimigo interno, e para fora nas nossas relações com os nossos vizinhos e para além também dos nossos vizinhos. Se a gente se reportar, por exemplo, ao fato que aconteceu há pouco tempo, em novembro ainda desse ano, quando o vice-presidente Hamilton Mourão ao fazer uma apresentação para o Ministério da Economia, colocou que a Amazônia brasileira seria uma espécie de espaço vital brasileiro, e que, portanto, precisaria ser defendida. Não sei se de forma inadvertida ou não, ou se de forma muito bem interessada, mas ele se reporta a um tipo de expressão muito cara à geopolítica. E com isso ele mobiliza, consequentemente, uma série de elementos muito particulares da geopolítica, como vocês dois, Fernanda e Stefano, muito bem apresentaram. E além disso, né, o livro, quando ele fala dos fatores processuais para compreender o retorno ou não da geopolítica, uma das questões que ele salienta é justamente a independência da academia frente a esse debate militarista que por vezes é trazido pelos militares. E algo que a gente talvez precise considerar para a realidade brasileira é que se a academia me parece, né, num primeiro momento, ser independente e se colocar de forma não só independente, mas combativa em relação a muitas dessas apreciações militaristas das relações internacionais, o que a gente vê hoje é, primeiro, um crescimento dos programas de pós-graduação das academias militares, o que sempre coloco que talvez esse não fosse necessariamente um problema em si, mas me parece que ele é um problema extremamente complicado quando a gente coloca ele frente a uma crescente desidratação, dos outros programas de pós-graduação no Brasil, principalmente os programas de pós-graduação e as iniciativas de fomento para pesquisas nas humanidades, né? E, além disso, um outro elemento que eu acho que talvez seja um elemento interessante é como essas duas conversas se fundem no debate sobre política externa brasileira. Apesar da gente ter no Brasil o Itamaraty como uma burocracia muito forte, uma burocracia que normalmente se coloca, de certa forma, imune a uma série de elementos do debate público e tem uma relação muito pequena com a academia brasileira, justamente nessa tentativa de se apresentar como uma burocracia independente, digamos assim, o que a gente vê hoje na condução da política externa brasileira é a construção, me parece, de, se não necessariamente um determinismo geográfico, que é parte também desse debate da geopolítica, mas de um determinismo cultural, que também pode ser trazido com o debate da geopolítica, como o livro apresenta em alguns capítulos de alguns dos estudos de caso, em que a gente vê hoje, talvez na política externa brasileira, uma tentativa de vincular o Brasil a um discurso civilizacional muito específico, da civilização judaico-cristã, e aí eu estou me reportando as palavras do ministro das Relações Exteriores, Ernesto Araújo, essas palavras não são minhas, que me parece que tem como repercussão a construção da imagem de uma identidade brasileira um tanto quanto purificada, né? A imagem de uma identidade brasileira cristã, identidade voltada para questões da família, conservadora, e que nesse sentido, tudo aquilo que escapa a essa construção identitária brasileira não se reporta ao Brasil, né? Tudo aquilo que está para fora disso não é verdadeiramente o brasileiro. Então, eu acho que o livro pode, mais uma vez, trazer muitos insights para que a gente traga esses elementos, talvez, para compreender a nossa realidade e, com sorte, evitar que algumas dessas questões sejam reificadas no debate público e no debate político. Então, mais uma vez, para alguém, pelo menos na minha posição acadêmica, né, para quem tenta dialogar com essas três sub-áreas, o livro foi, mais uma vez, um grande aprendizado. Então, eu espero que, enfim, aqueles que estejam assistindo a gente, aqueles que possivelmente possam vir a entrar em contato com o livro, consigam tirar tantos ou mais aprendizados do que eu ao longo desse processo de tradução. Então é isso. Professor Guzini, você queria fazer alguns comentários? Sorry, I spoke
well, thank you very much. No, it's perfectly fine. I understood, actually. The good news is always that Portuguese, when it is about international relations, about the academy, it's easier to understand for me than it is when you talk about normal things, which is then more complicated. No, I think in fact, I have not that much to add, except, again, thanking both of you for engaging the book and the thought. And I think, yes, one of the obvious points in which one could think about some of the findings in the book and Brazil is the effect of militarization that geographic and geopolitical thought has. One should not say that it's the only thing that brings you to more militarizing practice, but it's one that feeds into it. And as you connected it with the foreign minister referring to a more purified identity, it shows also how it can go hand in hand with a more nativist understanding of internal or domestic politics. So the two can go together. One should be careful that the geopolitical tradition can also be of the political left in some countries. So for Brazil, it is on the right because it's close to the military. In some other countries, it can be to the political left, or at least shared with the political left. It's particularly in France, this is the case. Because after the revolution, there was a Jacobin Republican component which didn't leave the military to the right wing. It was something which was also, and geopolitics has always been very, very prominent. There was no return in France. It had never gone away over there. They have institutes of polymology, which means that institutes of war, not peace research, in the country. So I think, and I'm also quite happy that you mentioned that this is, of course, as I said at the beginning, not an attempt to have the European story applied somewhere else. It is important to see whether there are, for instance, whether you could think of Brazil having a certain difficulty of defining its own foreign policy identity discourse, which has been shifting from the Lula administration to the present administration, and which is, it was not secure there then, and it's not secure now, because Brazil has not a clean sense of what it stands for, and therefore also not necessarily for what it can do afterwards. And then I wanted to come back to Fernando's correct point, I think very good point, about the multiple securitizations, which of course can be connected to, and I'm teaching also a course on environmental security. So there's there has been quite some links between geopolitical thinking on the one hand and the totality, the finiteness of the world, and sometimes the securitizing components in there, even by people who would usually consider themselves far away from nativism, nationalism, or anything else, but then at the end of the day, securitize a topic without necessarily being aware of the fact that this remilitarizes partly, or could at least remilitarize, an issue which doesn't necessarily need to be militarized in the first place. So thank you for coming back to this. And as I said, I mean, it's the reversal of Clausewitz, which is an old realist critique. It's Raymond Aron who criticized the US foreign policy during the Cold War for having reversed Clausewitz. And you can see really in this one sentence, which you have heard I don't know how many times, and which makes no sense for Clausewitz, namely that you won the war, but you lost the peace. Well, if you did lose the peace, you couldn't have won the war, because the whole reason for going to the war was to win the peace. So you cannot distinguish the military success from what the political success should be, because war is just a prolongation of politics with other means. It is not a thing on its own, and yet geopolitics tends, in this particular tradition, to militarize and to turn Clausewitz around. And as Fernando rightly said, critical geopolitics has, of course, worked on this for decades already. So they have done all the job of unraveling the classical discourse. So I could rely on this quite nicely in the book, which maybe that's interesting to note, has been more debated and more refereed by geographers than by international relationists so far. Maybe because they wanted to have also something which reaches out to IR. That's all. So thank you very much, and I just wanted to reinforce some of the points that you have been making.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have one question. It's from Davi Suchi. He says, thank you very much for being with us today and for your great talk. In your understanding, the COVID-19 crisis could play out as an identity crisis trigger, encouraging the militarist or realist understanding of the world that has been growing in recent years.
So let's try to be systematic. So in principle, you play the same game that I played with the end of the Cold War. So you exchange the end of the Cold War for COVID-19, and this will then perhaps trigger some identity crisis on the level of different security imaginaries, which might then potentially trigger the revival or a strengthening of geopolitical thought. I'm not, so could be, I'm not so sure, because it is, Of course, what you have is a securitization of health that is happening in several countries. That's for sure, because there are exceptional means which are made available. So instead of having our normal politics, we will get lockdowns, we will have special packages which allow commerce to close, well, at least in some countries, by being somewhat at least buffered by the government, which was an intervention that hasn't happened necessarily before. As you can see in the US, by the way, that's one of the reasons they have so much troubles getting these programs through the Congress, because it's contradicting the liberal type of division of labor, where the government should not play that role. And so you can say that there has been, in some regards, a kind of exceptionalization of politics, which very often is connected to security. But I don't see geopolitics so strongly coming back to it. Of course, it is connected to the environment, it is connected to nature. That's true, but I don't see geography so strongly as in there. I mean, the anti-Chinese component in Western politics has been there already beforehand. So it has just used this as a kind of, and now we're all quite happy that they have been able to get rid of it, because they buy our products. So they keep us alive, in at least for the Europeans and the Americans, that's surely the case. So I'm not sure, I don't think so. So I don't think that COVID has been used for populism, which is connected to some versions of nativism, which might be connected to some versions of geopolitical thinking abroad. But I think that's a long way. So I think the first one is easier. Yes, there have been reactions against the lockdown, both by the political left, who thought that this is an authoritarian inclusion into the private sphere, just as much as by the more populist right, which believes that the government should not introduce themselves into this, and it is all a hoax anyway. So I think that would be, but I'm not so sure it would be more than that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I give you the answer. So it would be, is COVID understood producing an identity crisis for particular countries in their foreign policy role? If yes, is geopolitics following? I'm not quite sure it produces that identity crisis in the beginning, but I might be wrong.
Thank you, professor. Eu acho que a gente tem mais uma pergunta. Então, Professor Guzini, I would like to hear your thoughts on the geopolitical turn of the European Commission and its relation to the rise of nationalist movements within the European integration process. Essa pergunta foi feita pela Vitória, aluna também do nosso programa de pós-graduação.
Thanks, Victoria. There has been, it is true that the European Union, who should be the last actor to have a geopolitical understanding, because it is based upon an identity construction, which is an identity construction against its own past. So in the securitization literature, or in the post-structuralist literature, Europe has this very bizarre feature, that instead of producing an other, which can be a friend, an enemy, or whatever else it is, but producing an other, a significant other, which is in the same time, geographically elsewhere, so the US versus the Chinese, the UK, and with the friendship of the US, and so on. Europe's other is Europe's past. So the bad thing we have, our enemy we have, is ourselves, yesterday. And that produces, of course, and the European Union is the stalwart of this particular vision, which is not necessarily shared in many countries. I mean, it's the one which has the EU, and the one which is the predominant one in Germany, because it's the way the German post-1405 identity could be rebuilt by shedding its own past. But it's not necessarily one which is shared by others. Nevertheless, the EU officially has this kind of a peace project in which we all come together, because we never want to return to the things Europe used to be before the EU. Now, therefore, it should be the last one to look for, well, what I just mentioned, versions of Malthusianism, social Darwinism, or anything of the kind. So when it speaks of geopolitics, the European Union, sometimes it just speaks in a loose language, where it means that it wants to play a major role in world affairs. And that's very often how geopolitics is used. I use a more demanding definition, but I think your question is correct. that there is an increasing awareness that in order for the European Union to be able to defend its welfare state regime and its relative wealth, it needs to play a bigger role in international affairs at large. And that is connected to classical realist thinking. So I'm not quite sure it's geopolitics in the strong sense, but at least it's a classical realist thinking that has come back ever since, basically ever since 9/11, I think it became official in there. Now, then you ask the question how this is connected to nationalist movements within the European integration process. I think the two are, so it is not that first comes nationalism and then the European Union decides to become more realist in its foreign policy. The more realist twist in foreign policy arrived earlier. It's after the end of the Cold War, the thinking that, well, that there's a new definition of international affairs and that the EU will be called upon, and was called upon by the US already at the time, to take up a bigger role and not leave it only to the US. And so it started being part of many of these interventions abroad, which EU countries had not been doing beforehand, including Germany. So I think it's before the nationalist movements were strong in Europe. I mean, they were strong in Austria and France already, but that was not their push, oh yeah, let's make a stronger European Union in terms of foreign affairs, because the nationalists are actually quite unhappy about the European Union becoming stronger in military or security matters, because if the EU gets stronger, then the state gets weaker, right? Because it takes over things from the state to the EU. So it does not, they usually don't want a strengthening of EU capacities in that regard. Yet, final point, it can well be that the general discourse of saying that we need to defend our interests stronger, that we are, that our wealth is dependent on us intervening, etc., etc., can of course be used by national movements for making the argument, well, if they say so, surely this, for our country, it could be working like that. So it can have an effect that was not intended whatsoever of strengthening some of the stronger national interest definitions that you can have within European countries.
Obrigada, professor. Eu tenho uma pergunta, enfim. I'm not sure if it's a good one, but still. Do you think, do you see this geopolitical component? I know you've been in touch with the hegemony transition debate, but do you see this geopolitical component playing out in this debate? And if yes, then how?
You mean in the US versus China taking over and so on? Oh yes, there have been a series of, and well, here I think it is almost necessary because some of the arguments are military strategy arguments. So of course you will find people referring to geographic factors which are in there. You will also have the ones who are more nervous about China's rise very often have a zero-sum vision of international affairs, which is close to the finite understanding that that comes out of Malthusian thinking. It might not necessarily be wrong, actually, in that particular one, because, well, I mean, it's not a zero-sum, but there's surely some loss for the US involved, because you cannot run the world currency just as you want. You cannot run world trade very much as you did beforehand. I mean, you can see that for instance, the European Union tries very hard to get Google and Amazon and others to pay more taxes, and not just to, and all of a sudden the United States, so usually, I mean, Trump was usually not very happy about Silicon Valley or any of those guys who are running these companies, but when they were under pressure from the Europeans, he made huge pressure on the European Union to defend. And of course, that will become more complicated when your economic power is waning. And so there will be arguments which are connected to classical realist power transition rather than geopolitics, but there could be geopolitical arguments attached to it. I mean, that will be quite clear if people, I mean, Luttwak would, I haven't heard him recently, but I would guess Edward Luttwak would be interested in such arguments, having worked on geoeconomics or geoeconomic competition beforehand.
Thank you, Professor. I don't think we have any other comments. Acho que a gente não tem nem mais nenhum outro comentário, mais nenhuma outra pergunta. O cérebro, às vezes, enfim, a mudança do português para o inglês, a gente escapa. Bom, então eu queria mais uma vez agradecer a presença do professor Stefano Guzzini, a presença da professora Fernanda, agradecer pelo debate, pelos comentários, pelas perguntas também que foram enviadas, e deixar registrado para o nosso público que o livro sai em 2 dias, então no dia 10 o livro, se tudo der certo, de acordo com o editor, o livro vai estar disponível pelo site da editora Unesp, para quem tiver interesse e quiser comprar o livro, quiser, enfim, se engajar com o debate, lendo o livro propriamente dito. É isso então, muito obrigada.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Obrigada, Bárbara. Obrigada, professor Stefano. Foi um prazer.